All right. Now, before we move on to this object, I actually thought I'd go over further into the projection tool because there are a few more, uh, you know, ways of mapping that I could use. One of which is cubic, and another one is atlas. These two I actually never ever use. In my opinion, they're almost useless because they never really give you any clean results. Well, I guess I could show you right now. One of which is this one here. Um, Again, useless result really. And then you have Atlas 2, which gives you a result like this, which makes fairly distortion-free UV maps, kind of. If I apply my material to this, they're for the most part distortion-free, but how is this going to work in Photoshop? I mean, there's all these cuts, and I have to worry about way too many seams. And I'm not really a big fan of this result. But anyways, let's go back to the cube. Another method that I haven't really discussed is if I use the projection tool and I use the atlas thing here, it automatically splits this object up like this. It gives me not exactly perfect mapping because I get some rectangles, some squares, and there's some distortion, but it's not bad. It's not horrible. I can easily select one of these edges, for example, move this down and just, make sure that everything's more squared off like that. It's not the end of the world. However, this of course fails a little bit more when you start having, more complex shapes than just, this cube where, you only have one polygon per side. So as soon as it gets a little bit more complex, well, then, you're going to have a lot more work. But usually, for the most part, I mean, you just, scale the entire group of polygons up or down and, and do that. So again, that's another method of automatically doing what I did earlier, which was to take the planar map and map it to different axes on this model, where if I choose the atlas, it automatically does that for me. Another way, of course, that I could be using to map is by going to the projection tool and using cubic. And this gives me something like this, which is not a perfect cubic map because what it doesn't do is, if I, for example, recreate this cube right now, and I go back to UVs, and I select a fresh model, and I create a cube, you'll notice that this is a much better result. It is still filling up a full UV map, my full texture, but if I shrink this down slightly, and I really should apply a texture map to this, and scale it down until this object is more or less, the texture map is square on this, well, the result here is really good. I mean, I can read from left to right. You get 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and, all the way around. So all this is connected through all these polygons here. And of course, during paint time, this is really, really useful. So if I try to, for example, paint right across here, well, you'll notice that line exists all the way across. So if I'm painting in Photoshop, this kind of stuff is really useful. So if you ever have a model, for example, and you want to add more detail to this and whatnot, and you want to keep your current existing UVs, then instead of doing things like extruding and whatnot, which will create new geometry, what you really want to do is you want to resort to tools like, just doing something like this and having to split these edges, because the split polygon tool will retain your UV mapping. If you'll notice that when I made this split across the model, it also made it along the UVs, and it's moving it proportionally to where it would be in UV space versus geometry space. So now I have added some geometry. So now if I subdivide my model, you'll notice that it's less subdivided, or I mean, it's subdivided the same way across the entire model, right? But at the same time, there's more weight on this edge here. So if I, again, subdivide and move that edge over and do this, you'll notice that You know, there's less curvature here versus there's more along here. So if you're ever doing this kind of edits to your model, you know, try to use the split tools often, and you know, at least that way you'll be able to retain your texture. Now, when is this technique useful? Well, it's useful for things like when you're given a model, maybe you know, a model from a video game, and you want to up-res it slightly without losing any of the UV mapping because the texture has been already done. If you want to make sure that your model is more or less identical to what it looks like in the video game, except you want to make it slightly smoother, well, smoothing out or using a subdivision on, you know, a video game model, usually, you know, video game models are very low in resolution, so you might get something like this where you have only one polygon here, one polygon here. If you start smoothing it, then all of a sudden that cube turns into a sphere. Not exactly what you'd want. So what you would have to do is to retain that shape but make it slightly smoother, is you'd want to do things like, you know, split up your model a few times. You know, do these kind of things where I'm splitting down in the middle and then beveling those edges out. So you can see my UVs are perfectly intact. But now if I smooth this, and it doesn't give me perfect results towards the corners, but at least my shape is somewhat smoother. Now this is a bad example. On a character I would definitely handle this differently. But again, this is, you know, one thing you'd want to do. So now let's move on to the, let's go back to this object here. And let's work on it.